Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 lecture for English A. Fleur and I have decided to do this lecture together. My name's Scott. You know Fleur, of course, already. She's been the one who's communicating with you on Moodle. I've been reasonably silent so far, but Fleur's had to let me out of the box this week. So we'll see how that goes. It could be a disaster. But we've decided to record the lecture via Zoom here, so we'll be sharing the slides and talking through some of the ideas together. We hope that will prove to be useful to you. Now, if there is anything you wanted to say before we get into the lecture itself?
I just wanted to thank everyone for bearing with us while we get our heads around how we're going to deliver this course in an online mode. And this is obviously an experiment, a new frontier for us, as it is for you. And we're hoping that you'll nonetheless still get a positive experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps we should get into the slides now. So this week we are talking about multimodality. That's the key concept and idea for the week. Not that other ideas are being displaced, but as we build up a set of concepts to help us all think about English teaching and learning in schools, this is clearly a key one. So you'll notice that the picture on the slide there is from a text that we'll be using this week in workshops called The Boat. For our minds, Fleur and I, it's a great example of a multimodal text. Now, you might have come across this idea before. It's certainly not a new one, and not one that's only talked about and discussed in English teaching fields, but it will be one that we revisit over the course of the year in various ways. So in terms of where we're trying to go today and the sorts of things we want to cover, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what multimodality is and why we should indeed care about it, what it has to offer us, and why it's worth thinking about, those sorts of questions. So we'll look at some examples, some dimensions of this idea of multimodality, tease out some of those, look at some examples, that sort of thing. We'll then make a link towards or from broader concepts of multimodality to practices within English classrooms. And then look at a couple of examples, and then we'll try and sum up and talk about what we think it all might mean in terms of our work as English teachers. So let's keep moving then. So in terms of this idea of multimodality, we might begin with what it is and how we might sort of understand it. So at one point, at one level, I should say, the adjective multimodal is a way of describing any text or composition that uses more than one mode. Now, that might seem reasonably self-evident, but as soon as we ask ourselves a question about what a mode is, then things might get a little bit more complicated. So obviously a multi-mode is more than one mode, but modes are not so simple and straightforward. Here's a list of some modes. Language, of course, image, sound or audio, gesture, space and layout. These are reasonably common modes. And there are a range of ways in which we might understand how these modes operate, but at a reasonably basic level, multimodal communication is the idea that these modes often operate in collections or in various sorts of combinations. It's very uncommon to find a mode that operates by itself, and so in fact almost all communication is some form of multimodal communication. If you imagine, for example, the lecture situation that we're experiencing right now is clearly an example of a multimodal communication. We have language in the form of writing on the screen. But of course, the screen is also communicating in other ways. In a very real way, it's not just a form of writing, it's also an image with colour, with some sort of design. Font suggests particular kinds of meanings, the colours do, the arrangement. Of course, many of us are very familiar with PowerPoint. It has its own sort of built-in ways of um, uh, arranging information. Of course, in sort of dot points, it sort of compels users to use that sort of way of presenting. In addition to that, we've got some videos up in the corner, Fleur and I, and of course we've got speech coming through as audio. So that's just, you know, an example of the way in which this form of communication is, of course, multimodal. You might think of any form of communication you've engaged in just today, whatever you've been doing, and to consider the kinds of modes that have been combined or connected in various sorts of arrangements and combinations just in your forms of communication today. I don't know whether you've got an example in your mind, Fleur, from your morning, but I'm sure that if I pushed you, you could come up with one.
I could come up with a couple.
Is anything that comes to mind? Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
No, it's actually interesting to think about. So, for example, this morning over my morning coffee, I saw some Twitter notifications on my phone, and so I clicked on the icon for Twitter, had a look at what the notifications were, and someone I follow, a friend I follow on Twitter, had shared another person's tweet that had some images of Jacinda Ardern. And there was a thread there about Jacinda Ardern with an image. And interestingly, some people were commenting on the image. They were analysing the image as well as talking about Jacinda Ardern. So that was clearly a multimodal text.
Yeah. So it's not very difficult to, in a way, to begin to understand this idea if we start from that position that really we can think of any form of communication as a situation where there are a range of what we might call multimodal or semiotic resources that are being employed to shape a particular kind of situation as a communicative or meaning making situation. And that can be from very simple forms of communication, or an individual walking through the world, to various sorts of very highly textured, very detailed, complex forms of communication, and everything in between. A couple of things worth noting here. As I said before, well, Günter Kress, who's a theorist in this space, who unfortunately passed away, it might have been last year.
Yeah, last year.
Very well-known theorist in communication, semiotics, and multimodality, wrote and argued, if you like, that that all of these modes are historical, or that they have developed over time to realise particular kinds of meanings in particular ways, and that modes have, if you like, a hierarchy of importance in different societies, and that those hierarchies of importance have been realised through time and through different historical periods. So it's not difficult to see the way in which some modes at the moment in our contemporary society are favoured or are used for particular kinds of purposes to make particular kinds of meanings. It's often been remarked that we live in a sort of image saturated contemporary moment. The spectacle society, if you like, or it doesn't take much to think about the way in which images come at us very quickly. The reporting around the coronavirus, for example, is a really good example of the way in which it's almost impossible to escape images coming at us from around the world about what's going on. Of course, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that might have been quite different. So different historical periods are associated typically with different sorts of modal combinations. The other point to make here is that language, in particular writing, in the contemporary times is often given a very high status in some forms of communication, in some areas of life and of practice and knowledge. So within the universities, within workplaces, within our political and government systems, the written word has a different kind of power, and you might argue that it has some sort of preeminence, particularly in authorised forms of communication. So I've noticed this week, of course, we have our Premier Dan Andrews here in Victoria, who will regularly hold press conferences for the media, but he'll also rely on written and published statements that provide clarity or the official word on what's happening in the state. So there again, we've got an example of a combination of modes, but also this idea that different modes have different forms of power, or play different roles in different historical periods, and the different modes have historically become more or less influential across periods of time as they've been used to do different kinds of work. There's a number of other points we might make about modes. One brief one that's worth thinking about is that when we take a mode, it can be realised in different ways depending on the medium in which it's expressed. Language is a good example of that. If language is a mode, that can be realised in different ways. So one medium, if you like, for language is speech. Now we make speech with our vocal cords generally, and with air that rushes out of those. That medium, the body and air, produces a different kind of, or is a different medium for language. If we think about writing, of course, that is using a different set of media or a medium to express the language mode. And we've briefly touched on the notion of affordance already, and this is really the idea that different modes have different sorts of meaning potentials. And so language, image, sound, audio, and gesture, for example, tend to express modes in different ways, and have developed particular capacities for realizing different meanings differently. So we'll pick up this issue with a couple of examples later on. So is there anything you want to add here about sort of this idea of generally what we're talking about when we mention multimodality?
No, except that you can link the affordance idea. Like that's been a really good introduction, thanks, Scott. But also affordance, we've talked a bit about in relation to lesson design in the first couple of weeks. So we've been asking people to think about how different forms of lesson, like the way you design your lesson, would be for different kinds of learning to occur. And so that idea of affordance and design is very useful for thinking about what you're doing, and also then what kinds of text you're selecting, what kinds of engagements with meaning making you want your students to experience. And so, yeah, different media also have different affordances for different kinds of meaning making.
Yeah,
so this idea is really quite useful for a number of different aspects of this unit.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well let's we'll keep moving. So just to take a couple of examples, we're going to look at some images and some settings, some context, which we hope will allow us to tease out some of the ways in which multimodality might be understood as a useful concept. So as we look at some of these examples, we invite you to ask these questions for yourself. So in particular, how does literacy, or more broadly, if you like, or meaning making work in the following contexts? What modes are being employed? How are those modes shaping the kinds of meanings that might be made? The first example is this stop sign. A pretty common enough occurrence for most of us who are driving along the road, and you might encounter some sort of image or a sign like this in the environment. It might in fact ask Fleur if she's got any thoughts about this one straight up, in terms of the kinds of ways in which a sign like this might provide or make or invite us to make particular kinds of meanings.
Certainly, culturally, the colour red tends to indicate some kind of alert or attention seeking. So in terms of semiotic resources, people who make signage using the meanings of colours, and we know that also as we learn how to drive and get our driver's licence, we learn about different colours on signs actually having different meanings.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's explicitly part of what your curriculum, if you like, for becoming a licensed driver. The simplicity of the message also suggests an urgency. There's no kind of extraneous information. It's just one word. And so it's about part of that attention gaining strategy. And there might be something to be said about the shape of the sign as sort of in the grammar of signage, if you like, that it's an unusual shape. So it's part of using a range of resources to convey urgency and the need to be alert to its message. And I know when we travel overseas and we see other signage, often some of that signage is quite obscure to us. We're not quite sure, not only because the language might be different, but because the conventions of signage in that country are different. And some of them might be the same. Red's pretty common as an alert symbol, but some of the signage might be quite obscure if we haven't actually learnt the conventions of signage in that country. So it's a good example of how medium are also culturally situated.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really key point that we might assume, for example, because we're familiar with a particular set of conventions or semiotic resources, or in this case, the colour red, that's somehow universal. But of course, it's worth reminding ourselves that signs like this and various kinds of modes that we've become perhaps familiar or attuned to are not universal. They're in fact learned, and they do not always cross cultures. And of course, we're not just talking about a national or ethnic culture, but all sorts of different cultures. So we're talking here about signs that often operate across or in sort of national boundaries or state boundaries. But of course, cultural conventions operate in all sorts of cultures, and a family can be a culture, a local community, a university class, a church group, whatever the case would be, a workplace, all have codes and conventions that are, if you like, derived from shared practices, and those, of course, become sometimes naturalized or neutral to us. But thinking about multimodality in this way can attune us to the way in which meaning making is, in fact, never neutral, and it is always shaped and mediated by our interaction with particular kinds of modes, and, if you like, semiotic resources that shape meanings in particular ways. So I think the humble stop sign allows us to do quite a little bit of thinking in this space. Maybe we should move on to the next one. Here's another. Now, for many of us, the front page of a newspaper like this, a paper version of a newspaper, even though this is a paper version represented as an image on a screen, is, of course, a classic example of a multimodal text, where we have all sorts of texts here coming together. I mean, the most obvious, of course, is that we have written text here, and we have pictures, visual images. And this particular screenshot or front page of newspapers from the New York Times from some time ago, but it gives us a good example of the way that images and texts in many texts like this are used together. So we have multiple modes interacting to support one another and to amplify particular kinds of messages. And so we might then also think about the way in which a text like this invites us to engage with it, and the way in which those modes provide opportunities for different kinds of meaning making. Of course, in a text like this, the images tend to draw our attention initially, or the masthead, or the larger font of the headings of the particular news articles. And as we read, the columns provide some structuring for our reading, and allow us to navigate through this text in a way that is a learned reading style. A text like this, given to someone who's unfamiliar with front pages of newspapers, would be probably a difficult negotiation exercise, but it would be one that would be possible because the modes that are being employed here provide some clues to how this text is to be read and engaged with. Not completely, but some. So again, another brief example. Here's the alternate version, if you like, to the current day or to the historical newspaper, the online newspaper. A screenshot from BuzzFeed. Many of you will be familiar with this. Is an older BuzzFeed front page. It's a bit different these days. But again, it's just an example of the way in which particular kinds of text, like newspapers, will employ different modes over time as they engage new audiences, as they seek to realise new meanings, as they seek to engage readers in different kinds of reading experiences. So, of course, the linear or the sort of horizontal columns of the New York Times are replaced by other kinds of structural features here. Of course, we're very familiar with these kinds of features now. I'm going to see if I can annotate this. So this might be dangerous. So obviously, features like this in a web page provide one navigation opportunity. Scrolling provides another, and then of course, most folks who have browsed an online newspaper will know that these kinds of boxes here provide us with access to articles, but also, of course, we'll be familiar with the kinds of advertising or other sorts of features that call out for attention and engagement. And so here we have, again, an example of an interesting and more contemporary multimodal text in a newspaper format that requires us to think differently, I think, about the way in which we might engage with these sorts of text and help young people to navigate or understand them. Here's a quick example of a different kind of mode. Many of you will be familiar with the LTV building if you've been on Clayton campus recently. And it's, I think, an interesting example of the way architecture and space can communicate meaning. I'm not sure what you folks make of this, but it certainly engages in a particular kind of architecture and employs, I think, particular kinds of materials that are suggestive of particular kinds of experiences, uses, and meanings. So as far as I know, the architects have designed this building to be somehow reminiscent of the sorts of materials that can be found in the Australian environment. And so you've got those bronzed window panels You've got the the representative of sort of the dust and the dryness of the Australian outback, perhaps the sort of sunsets that we might experience in different parts of the country. We've got the green panels down the bottom, and the sort of integration of those with the natural environment, the trees, the grass, and other things. So it can be useful as another example of multimodal meaning making, not just to think of the text that we might normally use in classrooms or newspapers or visuals, but to also think about the built environment around us and the way that structures particular kinds of interactions and meanings. And in a very real way, those are meanings and are important ways in which we come to understand our relationships and interact with people. How do you like working in the LTV, Fleur?
I'm getting used to it. I actually found it interesting. Someone described it to me as a cathedral for learning. So
Right.
they were making, and I understood exactly what they meant. They were making a link between the sort of, for those of you who've visited it, the vertiginous sorts of spaces where you can see all the way up through the whole core of the building into the ceiling with the light coming through those angled windows. And I found that was an interesting comparison. There is a sort of communication going on around wanting to elevate people or make people feel good about being in that space. I think that you could make a connection between that and earlier civic buildings for, like the local church. Yeah.
Indeed. It certainly, maybe the idea there is to elevate our aspirations for learning, or something like that.
I think something like that is intended.
Yeah. And of course, whether or not those affordances are taken up by the people who use a space like this, or whether we, as users of different texts like a building like this, have resistant ways of using them, or prefer to employ the particular kinds of resources not available to us in different ways, those, of course, are worth thinking about as well. Of course, the architects would have designed this building with things in mind, but people have a habit of taking up those resources in ways that are often different than the intended uses that they were designed for. Just another couple of quick examples. Here's a page from a manga called Nausicaa, one of my favorites. And again, an example of a text that might be used by young people outside of school and maybe inside of school sometimes. The interesting thing here, I think, that we want to point out is that if you try and read this text in the way that a reader in a Western a school system might have been educated to read in, you'll have difficulty. The text is not read in that way because this text it was originally written in Japanese and published in that country. The text is actually read in a quite a different way. In fact, instead of reading from the top left-hand corner up here, well, let me use something else here. What can I do? Instead of beginning our reading from this point here and moving down towards the other side of the text here, we in fact read in the other way. We read from this point here to here, this way here, around this way, here, here, and here. Again, I mean, we've made this point, I guess, initially that that modes are culturally specific, and here we have a good example of that, where the visual here, the written language is employed in a different way to realise meanings in this particular text. And so our typical reading path, the conventions that we've become used to as readers who perhaps have been educated in a Western education system, are in fact not going to help us here. And so we need to be attuned to the way in which modes can be used in culturally specific ways to realise different sorts of meanings. So if you are interested in these sorts of text, I would highly recommend this manga series. It's a fantastic one. In fact, I think you can get the Studio Ghibli produced an anime version of this text, and I think they've made all those available on Netflix recently. So this movie is called Nausicaa, or the Valley of the Wind. And, might be an interesting afternoon as a viewing. Now, just our final example. It comes from a more contemporary text. Now, I'm going to play this for you first. No. Okay. So, what might we make of such a text? I asked my daughter to describe this text for us all last night, and here's what she's written. So I'll give you a chance to read that. This is her writing. So Charlie D'Amelio and her 40.3 million followers are engaging in interesting set of interesting practices around these sorts of text. And of course, we're talking about reasonably, we're certainly talking about multimodal text, and we might be forgiven for thinking that this is a reasonably simple text, everyday text that might be sort of throwaway. We'll talk at different times in the unit about the complexity, indeed, of some of these texts. But at this point in this lecture, we simply want to signal the way in which multimodal texts like this are, of course, becoming quite common amongst the students. And in fact, ourselves, many of you will have TikTok installed on your phone and maybe regular producers of TikTok videos and sharers of these sorts of texts. You will, of course, have seen the way in which this particular TikToker Charlie is engaging in a set of practices that are reasonably common for those of you who understand the TikTok space and the sort of practices. And so we might think about what sort of modes are being engaged here, the way in which they're being engaged, the sorts of meanings that are being made by producers of these videos, but also viewers of these videos, and the kinds of communities, the kinds of conventions, the kinds of culturally specific ways in which the modes that are being employed here are being used to realise particular kinds of meanings. I don't think, given time, I want to say too much more about this, unless Fleur, you had something you wanted to say here.
I think there's a thesis waiting to be written on doing gender on TikTok.
So yeah, if anyone's interested in doing a master's, a PhD thesis on this sort of text and young people's use of them in education, then come and talk to us. Thanks, Lucy, for your explanation. There's another one, but we'll let you have a look at that yourself. So we've made these points briefly, but we'll just emphasise them again before we continue to move on. We'll sort of move on a bit quicker from here. But as we've indicated, modes are shaped through their use, and that use, of course, is cultural, historical, and social. And because of that, modes are used to realise particular kinds of social functions, like the ones we've been talking about. We've talked about the fact that not all modes are equal, that they're used differently, and they're valued differently in different sorts of social and cultural situations. And of course, modes shape the meanings that are able to be made in particular contexts with particular texts. and those meanings, sorry, are different. We realised in and through different modes. So we might now move to focusing more on schools and thinking about how multimodality has something to offer us as people who are thinking about communication and meaning making in schools. And these are the sorts of questions we'd be keen to encourage you to think about. For example, what kinds of texts are commonly found in schools? And as a thought exercise, you might think of a subject area in schools and the kinds of reading and writing activities that typically are done in that subject. So you might think of English, of course, but you might also challenge yourself to think of others if you're not familiar with other subject areas: maths, science, commerce, geography, the arts, whatever it might be. And to consider the sorts of reading and writing practices that are typically done across a school day or a school week in those subjects. Feel free to make a couple of notes there, but we'll let you do that in your own time. You might compare those sorts of texts that are commonly found in schools with the sorts of texts that young people engage with outside of schools. Again, you might think of your own morning or afternoon whenever you're watching this lecture, or your week. Perhaps you've got young people in your life who you can imagine the sort of text they're engaging with on a regular day. So we might begin to think about the differences between the sorts of texts commonly found in schools and those that young people might use outside of school. Of course, there's going to be some overlap, and there's going to be lots of commonalities. But there's also going to be some differences, and those differences might give us some reasons to think more carefully about the kinds of textual experiences that young people might be having in our own English classes. Here's one possible way of thinking about a student's trajectory through subject English in a high school. In year 7, 8, 9 and 10, these are the sorts of, if we looked at the kinds of texts that students were producing and engaging with across their high school careers, it might be that this is how it works for a lot of students. But it's not uncommon, I think, for young people in high schools to have this sort of textual diet, if you like, or this is the sort of limits of their engagement: text response essays, persuasive writing, argument analysis that many of you will be familiar with or scarred with if you've done your education in Australia or in Victorian public or in Victorian high school, or creative writing. And of course, they might be slightly differently tasked, they might have different topics, but generally those would probably be the main textual diet that students would come up against. And maybe you're asking yourself, well, what's the problem with that? And I think that's a reasonable question to ask. And we might not automatically want to see this as a problem, but certainly it might give us pause for thought about the way in which schools might engage with or contemplate this question of how are meanings made in our lives beyond school, and how might school, and particularly English classrooms, take account of those different forms of meaning making and textuality that are very common, and in fact you might argue in fact that forms of meaning making beyond the forms that are on the slide here are much more common in people's lives, but that at school we're asked often to engage in a very select range of textual practices. So another way to make that argument really is made here by Albers. She argues that modes of communication such as visual, speech, writing, gesture, music and so on enable humans to interpret and represent meaning. And meaning is not located within any one mode, but in how the modes are interpreted in relation to one another. So Albers is asking us, I think, prompting us to think about the ways in which we make meaning, but also the way in which, or the responsibility that English teachers might have for thinking about those other modes and how young people can be helped to make and create meanings in those other modes. If we're focusing on a particular set of modes only, then we might ask ourselves whether that's an appropriate response for English teachers in a contemporary society where meanings are in fact made through all sorts of modes. Now, I don't think that you folks would have come across the image in the middle yet. I don't think we've given you that reading to do. The image in the middle is an image of students' work produced in response to an English task in an English classroom by a colleague of ours, which we'll probably revisit at some time in the future, or visit in the future. Some of you might be familiar with the image on the left from Sean Tan's story and short film The Lost Thing, and David Metzenthen's text 1 Minute Silence. So these are examples of multimodal texts that are popping up in English classrooms these days and provide for some additional opportunities for meaning making. Fleur, did you want to sort of address any of these texts in particular or make any comment here?
Only that it's hard to see, but the image in the middle, there's actually, the bottle is in paper mache, so it was actually three-dimensional. It was a three-dimensional multimodal text that student made, but the task was to write a poem, I think, about an issue in your community or in your life, and this student chose to present the poem in this way. And clearly, by adding the images of the people at the bottom, and I think the bottle's holding up a figure in the grasp of the bottle, it adds something to the poem that the poem on its own perhaps wouldn't achieve quite so powerfully. So yeah, it's an interesting example of multimodality and assessment, which we're going to talk about.
Yep. Okay, so in terms of sort of focusing directly on English teaching a little more, we might sort of provide a bit of a summary here. So as we've argued, that print literacies tend to still dominate schools, and that's what we've tried to indicate here. There is some recognition, and a growing recognition, at least over the last 10 to 15 years, that multimodal ways of making meanings and engaging with texts are important, and those understandings have begun to emerge in curriculum in Victoria and Australia and internationally. So if you've had a chance to browse the Australian curriculum yet, or the Victorian curriculum, you will have seen or will see that curriculum specifically asks teachers and students to engage with multimodal texts in the classroom and to think about their creation, their use, and in all sorts of different ways that just wouldn't have been a feature of curriculum, say 15 to 20 years ago. So we might begin then to think as English teachers around these sorts of issues and how we might engage with the imperatives and the encouragements of curriculum documents, and the sorts of texts our students are engaging with and how we might bring those two together in meaningful ways in the curriculum. We'd, of course, encourage you to think beyond this idea of just making English relevant. Of course, that's an important thing to do, but we feel and would argue strongly that multimodal texts have more potential than just engaging kids with YouTube videos in classroom or with comics in classroom or something like that. That multimodal texts can be the focus for legitimate and complex meaning making, inquiry and design projects. It can really stretch young people to do things that are meaningful and authentic in lots of ways. And of course, not just creative, but also have analytic possibilities. And we'll be showing you a couple of ways in which that might be possible with some examples in a moment. Examples, what should we care? I think it's probably, I hope it's obvious already why we should care about multimodality and why it might offer teachers some opportunities that are useful. This was just a quick example. For me personally, and Fleur might have a different angle on this, one reason I think multimodality is interesting and useful for teachers is because of the way in which our young people and all of us are often confronted with challenges these days in navigating the media landscape. So when I think of multimodality, I often think of fake news. Why is multimodality useful? Because it provides young people with, or at least we hope it will, or it can, as teachers engage with multimodal meaning makings, it enables young people to navigate the media environment they're coming up against in more nuanced ways. When students, for example, understand how to read and make sense of and critically analyse the sorts of visual text, the sorts of multimodal texts that are coming at them from all different directions, I think they're in a much better position to make the sorts of meanings that are important to them and to create the sorts of relationships, identities that are going to be helpful for them into the future. So Jewett talks about this as a move from monocultural to monomodal to something that's more multimodal, away from forms of literacy that are restricted or that don't allow young people to realise a full range of meanings, and we want them, young people, to be able to do that, and towards what Jewett and Günter Kress, who we mentioned before, talk about making meanings through a process of design. We'll talk a bit more about what that means through our examples, but I'll hand over to you, Fleur.
All right, thanks, Scott. So the first example of us, two of us are going to talk about an example of using multimodal texts in the English classroom. The first example is a documentary film called Wasteland. And I taught this film for a Year 8 class, and it was a class with a very wide range of abilities and interests and learning styles. And so I was having to think very carefully about how I engaged them with this text. And also they really put me on the spot in terms of their diversity to think creatively about how I was going to ask them to show some understanding of the text and to engage with its ideas. So Wasteland's a documentary about an artist called Vic Muniz, who's originally from Brazil. He now works in Brooklyn near New York. And he goes back to Brazil. He goes to a large waste ground or dump called, I think it's called Garden Dramatro. And he engages with the catadores, the pickers who work in this enormous dump ground, and they pick through the rubbish for recyclable materials to sell on, and they live in more or less in slums called favelas that ring this wasteland. So it's about them and the work he does with them. And this was an exciting opportunity to teach documentary as a form, but also to have the students engage with the meaning making of this documentary in a variety of ways. To give you a sense of this, there's text there about what they do. And they work with the rubbish, with the garbage, to make art together. So this is the preview.
What I really want to do is to be able to change the lives of a group of people with the same material that they deal with every day.
Olha só, Vic, né, Vic? Isso não é futuro.
Então aqui nesse lixo aqui eu invento muita coisa. E eu também me sinto muito bem aqui nessa água, nesse lixo.
Sou Vic, prazer. Eu queria fazer a retrato dos catadores e o dinheiro todo da venda das fotografias iria reverter para fazer alguma coisa mudar aqui. Muito bom. Pensando assim, o que você vai fazer na hora que você sair daqui do Jardim Gramado?
Caraca, maluco. Nunca imaginei uma obra de arte.
Lot number 272, the great work by Vic Muniz, Pictures of Garbage. Well done.
Thank you. So I showed this as part of ostensibly a film study unit in Year 8, but I wanted the students to engage with the multimodality of the film in a variety of ways and to show understanding of the film. So we watched the film together, and I wanted them to particularly look at the artwork and the fact that the artwork itself was multimodal. So this is an example of the artwork. So they took a photograph of the catadors, and for those of you who are art buffs, you can see that there's particular artwork being referenced there, and they would project the photograph onto the floor as a plate, and then the catadors created through the garbage a picture, or they filled in the picture with recyclable materials in various ways, and then they took a shot of that. So I wanted the students to be thinking about the process of this artwork and to engage in the lives of the catadors in a way that gave them an insight that was embodied in some way. So I was thinking about the multimodality of embodiment as well as the multimodality of the text itself. So you can see here on the screen an image of a collage with some post-it notes on it. So what I asked the students to do is I put them into groups. I put them into mixed ability groups. I was also, I had some pastoral and social cohesiveness goals around this unit. It was early in the year, and I wanted the students to have some experience of working outside of their friendship groups and to create some more cohesiveness in the class as a whole. So I put them into groups of mixed ability groups and asked them to bring in recyclable materials to a lesson in the morning. And we created a big pile of recycled materials. I also brought some in. And in groups, their task was to design a poster that in some way represented an idea that they saw in the film and that represented their response to that idea in the film. And so they had a couple of lessons. There was paper all over the floor, there was glue, there was tissue paper, there were girls crouched on the floor, and they made these posters. And then the post-it notes, and if you can click again, Scott, there's another example here. The post-it notes were their written explanations of their design and how their design related to the ideas in the film. And it's interesting that all of them related to the relationships in the film and related to the bridging across boundaries, the idea that across people's boundaries of their lives, the things that separated them, that they might reach out and connect with each other. And this came through very strongly in the collages that they made. They then presented their collage to the class and gave a verbal explanation of the text. So this is an example here of asking students to not only watch a multimodal text, but construct multimodal text in response to it to show their understanding. And that multimodality does not necessarily mean digital. We tend to think about it in terms of the digital, but it could be something as low-tech as collage and written post-it notes. That's still engaging with a range of modes. And the students responded very positively to this task, and it certainly aided in the social cohesiveness of the group as well. Scott, if you could scroll through to the next one. I then asked them to engage with the artwork that was being alluded to throughout the painting. So I'm just going to quickly go through these. So we looked at the Gallinas by Jean-Francois Millet. Each group chose a painting that referred to the image, and they went and researched that painting and found out about what the meaning of that painting was, and then how that might relate to the meaning of the artwork that was made by Vic Muniz and the Catadors. And so they were able to relate this visual text to its background. So this is Zumbi on the left. He collected books for the Catadors to read if you found books in the garbage, and made a collective library. And he's represented as the sower. So he's sowing the seeds of learning amongst his people. And so that was one of the meanings that the students unearthed by engaging with that text. And lastly, I think there's one or two more. So this woman on the left, she was having a very difficult period in her life, and she's represented with an allusion to Picasso's Blue Period painting, which students then found out was a period of introspection for Picasso. And so this allowed us to talk about the artwork as carrying some kinds of meaning and symbolism. Again, this is a multimodal engagement with text. And lastly, the students did an oral, which I gave them the option of doing a short film themselves, and many students took up that opportunity and made short films. I had short films on recycling, and one group did short films on portraiture, the history of portraiture. So there was also opportunities for a negotiated curriculum. Students chose their own topic as long as it was linked to the film in some way. And that was a unit that I still regard as one of the most enjoyable I taught, and we used multimodality in a layered way. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Fleur. It's fascinating, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall or participant in that. I'm just looking at the time. Given that we've gone over an hour, maybe we can skip the Market Blues example, and people can have a look at that if they like.
Sure.
There's another example here that we've included in the slides, folks. A different kind of, maybe I'll give some brief background. This is an example from some teaching that I did quite a long time ago in the first couple of years of my teaching work in a government school in the eastern part of Melbourne, a reasonably average school, if you like. Had a range of kids who struggled with literacy and didn't always enjoy English. And this text is a text written by Kirsty Murray, who's an Australian author. And the text follows the experiences of a young boy named Sam, he doesn't live with his father, he lives with his mum. He lives close to in Richmond, I think, in town somewhere. And he visits the Queen Vic market and has some experiences there where he gets sort of transported back to marvellous Melbourne. I chose this text because I wanted a book that the students I was teaching could relate to, that they could see Melbourne in, and that they could see their sort of local city. But this particular task was one that I thought of as a translation task, where students were moving between modes, where they were exploring the way in which changing the mode in which the story or the narrative was told might make available different sorts of meanings or different sorts of understandings of the story and of narrative itself. So I'll let you have a look at those slides yourself. This on the slide at the moment is an extract from a larger sequence of work that students are doing. We had done a whole range of work before this around looking at storyboarding and shot types and camera angles and the way in which comics and graphic novels and those sorts of things provided opportunities to tell different sorts of stories in different ways. And so that's what you have there. There's a couple of questions there you might want to think about. We won't dwell on those now. And there's some examples of the students' work that they produced. As grainy, as sketchy as it is, I think you'll be able to see the way in which they're engaging with storytelling in a graphic mode. So again, we've got a couple of examples there where we're trying to indicate the way in which none of this work is perfect. It was based in a particular context. Fleur was working in a very different sort of school than what I was working in. and which made opportunities for us different. We had to respond to the needs and the interests of students that we were working with. And of course, it shows something of the times we're working in too. It indicates the way, of course, in which these ideas are taken up in classrooms differently over time. And I think we probably both do things maybe differently now. There's always things that we change. Now, be that as it may, do with those examples as you will, but we wanted to indicate some of the range of ways in which multimodality might be taken up, not just in presenting young people with multimodal texts, but also in asking them to become creators and designers of their own texts, and to use this idea of multimodality in a way that activates their work in English classrooms and allows them to become more familiar and more expert in the use of particular modes that perhaps are less emphasised and valued in schools, or certainly have been in the past, but that ironically, of course, are often highly valued beyond schools. So the example that comes to mind is the TikTok example from earlier. Young people creating texts like that, or their own graphic novels, their own YouTube videos, are engaging in work with different sorts of modes that often don't get exercised very much in their classroom work in English in secondary schools. We think that's a shame. We think that is potentially a blind spot or a problem for thinking about inclusive classrooms that are open to the needs of diverse learners, and beyond that, prepare young people for the sorts of environments, the sorts of meaning-making, multimodal and semiotic environments that they're confronting on a day-to-day, in the day-to-day, not just in the future, but also now. So there are lots of opportunities and so many interesting resources out there for doing this kind of work in classrooms that we really feel positive and hopeful about the opportunities that English teachers have to engage with these sorts of ideas in their work. And so we'd be encouraging you, of course, to think really seriously about the kinds of work that is typically going on in the classrooms that you get to see and experience and to teach in, and to push yourself to think about how might it be otherwise, if indeed students are only getting a narrow range of textual experiences, and how might you engage with the wealth of resources that are available to you to explore the meaning-making potential of different kinds of texts and modes. So just in finishing, we'll just wrap up. There are, of course, some challenges with multimodal ways of doing things in classrooms. As we've already indicated, we are less keen to think of multimodality as an easy fix to a disengaged classroom. Multimodality and those opportunities we've talked about are not always possible in the context that you might be working in. If you've got a limited range of texts on offer, or if technology or library resources aren't what they might be or could be. Often multimodal opportunities of the sort we're describing can be more time consuming to plan and organise. But that is not always the case, but it's something to keep an eye on. But it really is a powerful way to draw on students' existing forms of capital, which is often absent or devalued in schools. So we think it's more fun generally. I don't know about you, Fleur, but it sounded to me like you were having a lot of fun in that unit that you described, for example.
Definitely.
And at a practical level, work of this nature often produces more interesting work to mark and to engage with. So there are a couple of other points there to think through, but I think we'll sort of wrap up with the final slide, just some so what implications. Fleur, is there any of these that you wanted to take? I know I've done a lot of talking and I'm keen to give you
Sure. I really think that, I think we've covered most of these points, but this is just to reiterate. There is an idea of literacy out there that mistakes school literacy as the only legitimate form of literacy, but when we think about literacy practices in people's lives and the way in which they move in and out of using text in various ways, literacy is a repertoire of media, strategies, relationships, formats that people are engaging with in different ways according to different situations and purposes. And so we might think about how that fluidity, that idea of literacy as a repertoire of strategies and media might be used in our classrooms to open up our classrooms to other forms of literacy that also mean that students might be more likely to engage in some of the more formal literacies that we also want them to engage with. So I don't want anyone to mistake our message to be don't teach text response essays, but that's not what we're saying. But we are saying that thinking about literacy as a landscape of practices that people are engaging with over the course of their days gives us more range in what we're recruiting as we teach our students.
I think on that note, we might finish